thanks again to Will for the opportunity to collaborate with Games Night Viz to bring you this challenge. So what we have is we're looking at the top 100 female poker players. So if we look at our first input, that is a list of all of those players. So we have 100 rows there. And then if we look at the events, then this is a lot more rows, but we're seeing each of those events that these players have played in. And if we take a look at our input steps, we've just removed a couple of the fields from them, just so that when we're joining these two data sets together, it's slightly more digestible if we know we're not going to be using those fields at any point in the challenge. And the way that I determined if we were going to use them is that I kind of looked through the requirements, looked at the output data set and thought, no, I don't think we're going to need to use the player URL, the source or last updated fields, so I'm going to remove them. Okay, so once we've joined our data sets together, we then have our level of detail being per event. We have a row per event at the moment, and so we have about 8,000 rows. And if we move on to looking at those requirements, then first of all, we had to make sure that that prize USD field, the null values were replaced by a 0. There are a couple of different ways that you could do that, but I thought that it would be easiest just to double click on that null value when it was a null and change it to a 0. Okay, and then we want the ability to be able to count how many events each player has won. So we use this calculated field here called wins and look at the player place, and if that player place is equal to first, then we assign a value of 1, otherwise it's a value of 0, and that means that we can just sum up this field to determine the number of wins when we group by our player name. Okay, and then finally, we want to know how many events each player has played in. And we use a fixed LOD in order to do this. So we're grouping by our player ID and we're counting the distinct event name in order to get our number of events. Okay, next up we want to calculate the career event. So we're going to use a couple of LODs here again. Again, we're grouping on the player ID and we're taking the min event date for our first event, and then we're taking the max event date for the last event, grouping on the player ID. And then what we're doing is to determine that career length, we're taking a date diff, we're counting the number of days between the first event and the last event, and dividing that by 365 to make it a number of years. So the reason that we're doing that rather than doing a year date diff is because year date diff would return just a integer value, whereas we want to know the decimal value. So that's how we get to the career length. And then finally, if we calculate the biggest win, then what we're going to do there is again fix it on player ID and take the max all-time money field. Okay, so we could have done that in an aggregate step, but I just found it easier to calculate this beforehand. So lots of different ways to work with this. But now when we're bringing our data back to the player level, so we're going back to 100 rows, so we're grouping on the name here. We're grouping on that biggest win. So because we'd already taken the max value before, we're grouping on the number of events and the career length. Basically any of the ones where we used an LOD to calculate, we then need to group on by it. And then we're summing up the wins field, we're summing up the all-time money USD, and we're counting the distinct country, event country. Okay, so then to calculate the percentage 1, we're just going to take that wins over the number of events, and that will tell us how many each player's won as a percentage. Then we can remove some fields, rename some fields before pivoting so that we have our name and our metric and our raw value as our new structure. So we have 600 rows. Okay, and then finally, it's that rank that we need to focus on, so that scaled value. So getting that average position, which was a bit tricky when I first saw it in prep. So the way that I chose to do it, I'm looking forward to seeing how everyone else does it, is that I use just a normal rank of the raw value, making sure that I've got that in an ascending sorting in an ascending order. Okay, and then I do a modified rank as well. So grouping by the metric, partitioning on the metric, should I say, ordering by the raw value in an ascending order, and taking the modified rank. If you've not met the modified rank before, then this is basically any time that we're using the rank interface that, for example, we just used for rank. This is the calculation that gets written in the background, as you can see up above this modified rank field. So we're just taking that and calculating the modified rank in a very similar way. Okay, and then the way that we then get our scale value is by adding these two values together and dividing by 2. And that gets our scale value, so we just remove those additional fields and we're ready. So thanks very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed the challenge this week, and thanks again to Will.